Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast, presented to you from Cape Town here in the Western Cape, South Africa. The podcast is presented with a view to providing a platform and voice for built environment professionals and interest groups who are working towards transforming the places and spaces here in South Africa. It's dedicated to the individuals and community groups who are supporting both the formal and informal processes that are shaping our cities and our spaces. Welcome to our first Talking Transformation podcast of 2021. We wish all of our listeners the very best of health and good fortune for the year ahead, and no doubt we are all going to need that good luck and good fortune. We're picking up where we left off last year with a conversation with a former colleague of mine from the City of Johannesburg and his reflections on a particular moment in time that has come to shape the legal fortunes of municipalities in dealing with temporary accommodation for evictees. Today we talk to Zunaid Khan, presently Chief Director at the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation within the Office of the Presidency. But today we're revisiting a decade ago, in 2011, and specifically the landmark Blue Moonlight housing case. A case that via the Constitutional Court ruling provided that the state is liable to provide alternative temporary accommodation to unlawful occupiers who may be rendered homeless due to an eviction from a private property. The case also indicated that a private owner's right to property may be limited by the rights to housing of unlawful occupiers. And Zunaid was very much on the front line of the city's response in the legal case. I asked him to reflect not only on the merits and the details of the case and what the ruling meant, but also the reality and the pressure of being a civil servant very much in the legal firing line. He recently has spent almost a year acting as Deputy Director General within the department and has a distinguished career spanning almost 2 decades. He's worked within the private sector and he served within both local and national government. Given his current role within the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, we also take a quick look at the spatial planning horizon for 2021. What are his hopes and what are his fears? Beyond the pandemic, beyond the economic challenges we face, what is it we can hope for from the National Department and where we should be looking for in the future around issues of spatial transformation and economic growth? As always, we hope you enjoy the episode. Feel free to contact us on Twitter at TalkingTransfo and the number 1, or contact us via email via talkingtransformation101@gmail.com. Enjoy the episode. It's just gone 6 o'clock here in Cape Town, and up in Gauteng, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Zunaid Khan to the first Talking Transformation podcast of the year. Zunaid, how are you keeping? What's news up your way?
Thank you, Pete. It's good to be here and be part of this discussion with you. I think it is a tragic day for us. We had the passing of our Minister, Minister Jackson Mthembu, which has hit home hard for a lot of folk in the GPME
I'm sure.
and others. Some tragic news for us, not something we expect to hear. So we wish his family and others our deepest condolences. I had the pleasure of working closely with him. Wonderful man, not just as a minister, but very insightful, very approachable. Terribly unfortunate to hear about that one.
Well, thanks very much for sharing those thoughts on the passing of Minister Mthembu. I really appreciate you still finding time in your diary, Zunaid, to chat to us. And I think those are beautiful words. And again, a lived reality for tens of thousands of South Africans who've passed, and the families, the countless thousands who've lost people through this pandemic, and our thoughts go out to all of them. And all we can hope for, Zunaid, is a better 2021 for the country. I look forward to our conversation towards the back end of this around, what is it that if we start thinking about issues of spatial transformation, about recovery, and that type of thing for 2021, I'd love to hear your thoughts, particularly through that lens of the National Department that looks at things around a very strong monitoring and evaluation premise. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you for being here. Let's, for the moment, rewind to a conversation that you and I picked up on about a couple of weeks ago, in fact, turn of the year. And I was saying, it's almost a decade since you were involved in the Blue Moonlight case. Very significant Constitutional Court case. And in our conversation, it was really a thought of saying, why don't we come back into this space and have a conversation, given how foundational it was in terms of legislative ruling around human settlements and property rights, And I'm going to ask you to really say, let's rewind to that point. It would have been around, I guess, 2010 when these things started to move. It ended up in 2011 in the court case. What was the first time you came to hear about it and learn about the case itself and what would start to frame the years ahead for you?
Thanks, Pete. It is a trip down memory lane, and I had a friend once who said it's a trip down amnesia lane that we're taking. Some of these things we'd like to forget, but it was a really interesting experience at the time. At that point in time, I was in the Department of Housing, and that wasn't the forte. I wasn't dealing with that particular matter. And I heard about it, I think, around November or December of 2010. I wasn't really involved in the matter per se at all. And come 2011, the executive director at the time, walking down the corridor, and happened to see me and said, he used to call me Uncle Zoo. He said, Uncle Zoo, this is for you. It was a file with that Concord decision. And I opened the first page and I said to him, sir, I'm not an attorney. I'm hoping you're aware of this. He said, I know, but this is your duty now. You're going to handle this. This is the matter before you. Besides that fact, you're the only one who comes in here every day in a suit.
So that was the criteria.
Go ahead. Yeah, this.
And so this case file that he passes you is basically a hospital pass, I would guess. I mean, it was a very hot topic. And, in terms of the way that it's structured, our thinking, even 10 years on, about municipal responsibilities, property rights. I mean, what were the heads of argument? How do you recall the sort of summary of the case? You're working for the City of Johannesburg. Who brought the case and who were they representing?
At the time, I think it was the occupiers of a building in Saratoga Avenue that the case involved. And it involved, I think, a property owner called Blue Moonlight. They wanted an eviction order done for occupiers of their particular building because they wanted their building back. And one of the key things about this particular matter was the fact that prior to that, the city had provided or made available temporary accommodation for any matter that involved where the city conducted the eviction. I think one of the key points was that there was a distinction made between where the city led the eviction and a process for its own development purposes versus the rights of a private property owner. And that became a sticking point in this matter because the Concord at the time, I think, drew that the city's housing policy was unconstitutional, not in totality, but because it made that distinction, that differentiation. And it shouldn't, because it should factor into its consideration the circumstances of those occupiers and the circumstances post the eviction. If they are to be rendered homeless and without that accommodation, you cannot make that distinction and say it's not your responsibility. I understand. I think at the time they were, if my memory serves me correct, represented, I think, by the Center for Applied Legal Studies. And it was a landmark case in the sense that for the first time, municipalities couldn't draw that distinction. They couldn't make that distinction. The other was the fact that you had to provide temporary accommodation as the municipality. The third part to that process that I think also caused a bit of a consternation, if you like, was the fact that there was the issue around responsibility between the three spheres. And the city indicated at the time that as a municipality, it's not the primary response. It doesn't have the primary responsibility for that progressive realization of the right to housing. That it's actually secondary, and that it requires participation. Effectively, the primary right sits with the national government and the application for funding through the province. And I think the Concord was correct. I can't say I think it was correct, it was correct actually, in assessing or making the assessment that that's not the matter that's at hand. The municipality is a congruent function, and through the collaborative and coordinated approach of government, it means the municipality does have a responsibility. So that was the understanding. It went through a long process. I must be honest, prior to that, I didn't have much experience with the law. I recall Groot Boom as a particular matter. But beyond that, I tended to keep myself away from the long arm of the law. this particular matter raised these significant issues for municipalities. The other was the fact that this, as a constitutional court decision, meant it was applicable countrywide. This isn't something you can now debate. And one of the key things about this was, how do you respond?
I mean, I think it's fascinating because, as you say, you're almost describing this. There's at least three different angles that we're looking at. There's the owner, the rights of the property owner. There's the rights of those who have been occupying, and then there's this sort of constitutional, those blurred responsibilities in human settlements or housing. Very much one which is split between, as you say, the national, the provincial, and the municipal space of governance and the responsibilities that are shared and co-competencies. But as you say, this is the first time that the municipality, in Johannesburg's case, was being tested in terms of how strong and coherent is your plan, how does it stand up against the constitutional obligations, and then ultimately saying, well, who's responsible? And I mean, that's interesting that you're saying that up until that point, it had been seen very much more that it had been a provincial and or national issue, more so than the city's issue. Am I understanding that correctly, Zunaid?
Yes, it was, Pete. I think very much so. And I think at some point, in all fairness and in truth, I think as the municipality and the state, through the various discussions post the Concord decision, I think there was an understanding that was an error at some point. I think playing the card between the three spheres was problematic because at the end of the day, I mean, and it's an old adage that while this was happening, for occupiers in particular and the more vulnerable in society, it's the old adage that the grass suffers while the elephants fight. And I had a good colleague, Jack Kosef, used to say the grass also suffers when elephants make love.
Is it Jack saying, if ever there was one?
Oh, good old Jack, man. And I think that was an error in part because the Constitutional Court was right to say that that's not being assessed. I mean, if there's a need for funding, that's one thing. But it also noted that in terms of an emergency situation, an emergency housing, it's also the obligation of the municipality to provide that funding and make that funding available. In the court case itself, it noted, and there was a distinction that had to be made, that this isn't one of those time-sensitive emergencies. It's not a fire or a national disaster that takes place unexpectedly within seconds or minutes. It's a very different type of emergency. It renders itself such because if during an eviction process the actual occupiers are about to be rendered homeless, that in of itself constitutes an emergency. So it is, I think, very different to understand what emergency means in that context. But the court noted at that time there was no contestation from the parties about whether this renders an emergency come to that. It required, I think, a very different way of connecting the dots. And I think, Dave Chappelle recently said there's the risks of standing too close to an elephant. I won't use the vulgar term he used to describe it, but he noted that all you see is its wrinkly skin. You don't see the whole elephant. And I think at that point, going on for 5 or 7 years in a matter like this, sometimes you lose sight of that connectivity. The mayor at the time, I think, pointed out that we cannot lose sight as a city, that we do have an obligation to the vulnerable in us, within the city and in society. And we got to find a way to address it. I think, the landmark ruling in what was required, I think it helped in some way because it also, and that's what the court had to assess, whether an eviction will be just and equitable if it renders folk homeless. They don't have an alternative to go to. And who takes down that responsibility? And you're correct, it also recognized the rights of developers. And that's something the city also has to recognize. It requires development, it requires rate payments and others. So you need these moving parts to be managed in a particular way. And to a large extent, a lot of it centers around how municipalities manage that connectivity, that interface, and how this coexists, if you like. And I think very much so that's what that Concord ruling brought us to.
Perhaps just give an idea of what the built form is that we're talking about in terms of what the structure looked like, how many family members were living there in terms of households and so forth, and what was it that the property developer was intent on exercising in terms of his or her rights and desire to grade that property or redevelop it?
It was the eastern part of the inner city. It's usually higher density development,
Sure.
high-rise apartments. It's close to not far from the very famous Ponte Tower.
Yes, indeed.
So just down the road. So even if you don't know Joburg that well, at some point if you've landed here, day or evening, you would have seen that building, the tower. At once, I think a Coca-Cola sign.
Indeed.
That
Vodacom
was on
as well,
the roof.
some state,
Vodacom, that's right. Yeah. So if you know the tower, Ponte, this was down the road from there. So very much in that same mold. Right. High density building. I forget exactly how many floors and stuff. But the owners wanted to refurbish and get it back to a particular level to make it, I think, for whatever reason they wanted. And I think one of the things that was put forward at the time, I think, was also for student accommodation and others. The building had been occupied for many years. It was in a state of decay, disrepair. So that was an issue. But I think, as noted in that Concord decision, it wasn't necessarily that the occupiers had invaded it. Some of them had been staying there for many years.
Right.
And over time, the building had deteriorated. And that's an important thing to keep in mind here, because, these were people who've lived in the building for many years, but even over time, due to a range of different reasons, complexities, whether that's a reduction in the rental received, landlords absconding from their properties, or slumlording in some cases, a range of different issues, but the building decayed significantly. And I think at the time it was about 86 occupants, made up of a range of people, individuals, different age groups, kids, pensioners, some disabled folk. And I think within that context, the Concord also stated there that you need a differentiated approach for those occupiers. They need different solutions or access to a range of different options. So that was the original, I think, a number of people that were provided in the Concord judgment. It did change significantly after the judgment. The numbers went up, if my memory serves me correctly, to I think 126 or 136. It was not just the original folk who were on the original list. And so within that context, like I'm saying, the property owners had a right to access their building for what they wanted to do with it and bring it to a particular point. I think it was their investment. And I'm not sure if the Blue Moonlight was the original owners who had purchased the building. I speak under correction, I think they were the purchasers of the building. So obviously they need their return on investment. It's important. They've got to do this. This is part of the natural way of doing things. And then, of course, there was this instance here. And I think one of the things was what was intended to happen wasn't, or the redevelopment wouldn't have suited the current occupiers. They wouldn't have been able to also afford the rental. I think the average earning at that point in time was, for the occupiers there, I think they averaged at about 960 Rand a month. So that made it, then became incumbent upon them to actually get the eviction order and then have these occupiers move somewhere else so they could get their building back. In many cases, for many inner cities, eThekwini, for example, part of Cape Town, I'm not so sure if it's so much of an issue there. Tshwane has a similar circumstance. These were some of the things that started to take place. There were a lot in different circumstances and different eviction matters. I mean, I think at some point the city indicated at that stage it was getting approximately 200 eviction notices a year at that point in time. That shot up tremendously post this Concord decision.
I'm sure.
An important thing to keep in mind, Pete, is that it centered around a particular high-rise building in a city. But the Concord decision doesn't differentiate to say it's only applicable to an inner city.
Of course.
And to high-rise development. The matter is about eviction, obviously related to the PI Act. And within that context, this particular matter refers to where occupiers of a building or in this, will be rendered homeless and require that alternative accommodation and assistance. One of the key things, though, or one other key thing in this matter, and I notice in many other spaces, whatever, they often leave this out, the Concord ordered the city to provide temporary accommodation. And that's an important distinction because it was what was sought by the occupiers in the first place, was temporary accommodation. Because the city, and rightfully so, I think at some point it was also joined by the province and the National Department, very, very clear that this process cannot subvert the state's program of delivery and allow a form of queue jumping or people to circumvent that process to use it to acquire long-term accommodation out of the state. And I think that was very important. And in many discussions and with others, rights groups and others, some friends, colleagues that I know quite well, they often left out the word temporary. But be that as it may, one of the things that they noted is that the Concord cannot define what temporary is for a municipality. It doesn't have that power, it won't take on that power. That is left to the municipality to define. What is the nature of temporary, the nature of the accommodation? What does it mean? How will they transition? How do the other delivery programs and avenues come together so that these occupiers can move on and find, and of course, meet that progressive realization into that right?
I'm trying to think back to that period, Zunaid, and it's in the aftermath of the 2010 FIFA World Cup. We've talked about that in recent episodes, about the legacy of that. And also at the same time, the major city initiative to regenerate and rebuild that central business district, major challenges it faced in terms of repositioning itself post 1994, in terms of trying to build back, in terms of, after mass flight to areas including the Midrands and Santons of the world. So, this was obviously very important for the city, not just in terms of the governance element and the legislative ruling, but really in terms of setting a governance framework for that area, which has always been such an important, the primary business and high-rise residential area of the city of Johannesburg. Any thoughts on that in terms of the broader context of what the city was trying to do at the time? I think of the city charter for the CBD, and really trying to retain and build its business that had been around the time that obviously how Train would have been reinvested in that space. You've seen social housing units and institutions becoming active. So major churn and rethinking, recalibrating, if you want to think of it that way, of the CBD. And this is one of the things that was forcing us. I also think of things like the hijack buildings, the bad and better buildings programs. Crikey, there's just so many initiatives at that time, and here's a landmark court judgment at the same time.
I think, Pete, you're correct. I think the city was heavily vested to turn that around. Having decaying buildings and others limits or prevents investment, has a very negative impact on a city centre. And that has further implications for its residents, because there is a decline in revenue. Those are important aspects to how a city is able to provide urban management, ensure it's able to maintain its infrastructure, ensure that it's functioning, and that its residents can actually get access to it and use it effectively. And I think at that point in time, there was a strong drive to actually, I won't say reinvent, but maybe to a lesser extent, but that's what the city was looking for, to address some of these issues. As you mentioned, there was the bad buildings program, there was better buildings, and I think there was also the issue around hijacked buildings. And the city was attempting at the time to get to a point where it had a more systematic and process-driven approach to addressing this. I think the nature at that point in time, before this Concord ruling, was also that a lot of it was ad hoc. They came in different avenues. Like I'm saying, you get 200 eviction notices a year. It depends which one gets to court first, which one is deemed an emergency, and the city having to respond very quickly. It was doing some of its own developments in certain areas and creating decant facilities. But I think in many ways, what the city was also trying to do is ensure that, and former councillor Rihanna Musa used to always talk and remind us about this, the city is certainly obligated to the most vulnerable and the poor, but a city isn't only about the poor. The city is for all its residents, and there's a range of other moving parts that ensure that that space is also workable and livable for both the poor and those who are not. And you've got to find a way to how to get that to work together. And so as part of that process, I think the city, and to be honest, this particular Concord ruling also forced the city to take a more systematic approach in how you address this. Don't make the differentiation, but if this is the case, how do we actually manage this in a coherent way, as opposed to having these matters purely come out of the court to say tomorrow provide for this one and the other. If you don't have that, you cannot fund it, you cannot manage this process. And even from a housing perspective, you cannot budget effectively for this and say this is what you'd like to do because these are coming out of legal matters. But I think that you're certainly correct in saying that the city wanted that reinvestment. I mean, there's too much infrastructure, there's too much history, heritage, there's too much potential in those neighborhoods to let it go to waste. You face the conundrum at times that certain of these buildings, particularly like you mentioned, hijack buildings and others, there were residents from some of those buildings who would come to the city and engage with us on that very same matter. Sharing insights about having armed gangs run buildings, no access to services, infrastructure decaying, the hazard it is to their children, the dangers if you have young daughters in these buildings, having gangs collect rent twice in a month. Those are some of the things, is the criminality aspect that you also have to address, where residents are then exploited, and particularly the poor, by the criminal element that's involved in this. And how do you address this and find a way that by reinvesting and reinventing that space, you can still make it livable and accessible to many, and give people access to the city, but also establish a type of collective responsibility in the space. And that became very important. I think the former MNC for Housing and some of the buildings that were launched in Berea, Hillbrow, and others talked about the same thing with the residents, that you do have a role to play in this process. It's not just the city driving everything, but you have an important role to be part of that process collectively so that the city starts improving these spaces, work to have them much more livable, addressing issues in criminality, like I'm saying to you, ensuring the spaces are safe to use, to walk, kids to access different services, and effectively rid the city of some of the ills that are associated. Often that for a lot of folk you won't see unless you go in these buildings, we go into those spaces and see what's happening. You won't be aware of it. Some of it's myth and folklore, some of it not. They're real things that take place in these buildings. Some really, sad and heart-wrenching things that you'd see. And so I think the city was very much inclined to do that. I know there was a lot of critique at some points in the city trying to prioritize something different and kick out the poor and stuff like that. And I think, no, I can say that to you, that wasn't the case. I think that, soundbite and rhetoric, it was drummed up loudly, but that wasn't necessarily the case.
Prior to you working with the city, you'd had a very successful urban walkabout tour where you had taken various people on walking tours of the CBD of Johannesburg, and you'd sort of, from your graduation at WITS, you had built this sort of private touring element. And now here you are, a couple of years on, having landed in this amazing sort of opportunity and space within the city. You're dealing with this huge amount of complexity, Zunaid, and almost, I say, learning on the job. As you said, you've got no legal background. Your WITS graduation was in respect of town and regional planning. So, I mean, what did you learn? What was that learning experience like to get into something that was extremely legal? You're dealing with senior counsel. You're facing, I can imagine, the personal pressure of wanting to do well. But at the same time, most planners are driven with a social conscience as well. That starts to question sometimes some of the, let's call it, political agendas or otherwise. So, I mean, how did you manage all these things, and what did you learn in that process? And I think that's one of the things that we're wanting to get out of this conversation is, how do people prepare themselves? How do people think about when things get very serious? Because it's one thing, one of the catchphrase I always have, if every time I've been told I'm going to get taken to court, I'm still waiting. I'd be a very rich man if I got a rand for each time I'm told that. But you're living proof that sometimes it does happen, and it's a serious business. It's not something to be taken lightly. So again, I'd just like you to reflect maybe on that whole thing of the learning experience within the legal space, and what did it mean to you as somebody with a lot of experience in thinking in more the private space, but now you're dealing with it in a very corporate governance space in a metropolitan authority, dealing with the constitutional court. It doesn't really get much bigger in terms of a remit.
You're correct. I did some of those tours, just to give you some background quickly and context around this, and why I think sometimes a career chooses you. some of these paths. Because my dad worked for a company that managed a lot of buildings in Hillbrow, Judgement Park in Berea, right through the 70s and the 80s. So I've had lots of experience in Hillbrow, even as a kid. And I got to hear from a very different perspective about those rental boycotts, organizations like ACTSTOP and the others, and what happened then. I got to see some of the transition over that time. The other was doing those tours. Yeah, I did walking tours in Hillbrow, so many times in Ponty Tower and others. Some of the locals there took us around. Little Lagos, as the place was affectionately called, in Hillbrow, as well as Mimosa Hotel. I've been inside the infamous Mimosa Hotel many times. I think it's a lot different now. So I'm not sure if it was some sort of destiny to get to this thing. One of the things was, Peter, I could tell you, I had hair when I joined the city. And I think 2 years into this thing, I lost most of it. It is a difficult thing. And one of the things you realize is that you got to have a good support network and team of people with you, and the city had. The city had some really dedicated, good staff, even in its legal division, not just in housing, and others who really came to the assistance. And I don't think I could have done it without them. There were also some of the private sector attorneys who were part of the process, some who I'm still friends with today, who really helped for me to understand and get to know how the judiciary works and how things work. Because up until that point in time, I'd never been into court. It was interesting to find, how that happens, how they work, how they think, and also share with them that from a town planning perspective and housing perspective, what the development practicalities are, because often they don't know, so they know the law. So that was an interesting thing it was very much a learning experience and knowledge sharing. The other is the fact that I was a city employee, and there was a legal person who happened to tell me that we are employees of the city. And I had my wife's former boss actually was very influential around this. That before I joined the city, and when I told him I was, and he said something very critical to me at the time. He said that there's 3 times in your life when you're held to a higher level of accountability. One is when you work for God. The other is when you work for NGOs and others, donor money and what that cause is. And the third is when you work for the state. And I've always kept that with me. And when I joined the city and took on this matter, I said that I want to do the best I can, that I must go out to defend and go out to bat, to use a cricketing term that you'll appreciate, go out to bat for the city, because that was important. I think sometimes officials in the city or even in the state, really reduce what they know and afraid to use what they know. And so it became it was a tough learning experience. I mean, one of the things I can share with you anecdotally is there was a former councillor there, and I won't mention him by name. We had studied together. We had a particular vice, and I still have mine. I don't know if he does. So we would do it in the basement of the housing building. And he happened to ask me.
Talking about smoking, Zunaid, yeah?
That is correct, man. And that's one way to cope with this thing. You got to have some, if you know a good barman somewhere, and you smoke, whatever those are the things that could help you. But he happened to cite that to me one day. He said, he asked me, he said, why did you come to housing? Of all the places in the world, why did you come to housing? I said to him, well, why not? I have a penchant for this. I've always enjoyed it. And I've had experience with this thing. So I think given that context and being some of these buildings and seeing and walking around the inner city, you get to see things very differently. You get to connect the dots. You get to see some of the lived realities, which aren't my lived reality, but you get to experience it at a very different level. And start to appreciate how the city functions, and sometimes how between our policy and our lenses of observation, whatever, they reach a particular level, but there's an entire ecosystem, if you want, that functions outside it, that unless you get there and spend some time there, you won't actually know. So I think that was that helped. The nice part is, like I'm saying, we had good colleagues. And I recall with this particular matter at the time, I was on leave and out of the country, when we actually had to make that compliance, and it was slightly out of the deadline. But there were colleagues in housing who were admin staff and others, secretaries, who on that day that these occupiers had to relocate to the facility that was provided, and it was on a weekend. And I think it included a long weekend with a public holiday. They availed themselves to do so. There was never talk about overtime and others, they just were dedicated to this cause, were dedicated to the city. And I think that, yeah, and that was very helpful. There was good support and, friendly banter about this thing, and people who really wanted to see it happen. The other was, I think we also got support in some of the higher offices, which was also good. And you're right, you do have to take on legal counsel. Excuse me, there's a particular advocate, I think, who never liked me because we had a difference of opinion about what should be done. And I think he suggested at the time the city just find any available building and just give it to occupiers, let them have it for whichever court case came, even if it was office or whatever, let them just have it indefinitely. We had quite a running battle. I think the CEO of Joshco and I had a fantastic running battle at the time, and because I had to take one of his buildings to meet this compliance for another matter. And it was that. It was, it was professional, it was heated, it was passionate, but there were folk who cared. It may sound overly cliched, but I don't think so. I think there are a lot of government, municipal officials who are on that front line who actually care. Putting it in there, and you're right, Pete. I know on the other side of planning, there are those threats. Some of our colleagues, unfortunately, have had death threats for their policies and others in the city, which is unacceptable. Around these type of buildings and evictions, we've had advocates for the city who were representing the city assaulted, locked in buildings. Myself and the executive director once locked in a building, occupiers. Despite all that, find a range of people who still willing to go out to bat to do this, who share that passion and a drive to make this happen. And it's more than just compliance; it's actually the application. And one of the key things here, and I can share this anecdotally with you as well. I think it was CALS, the Center for Applied Legal Studies, in our first meeting with the councillor, the MMC for Housing. We engaged, lots of comments made, things, whatever. And of course, me being who I am, we engaged around the matter, and I pushed back at a certain point in time because they were making some really unrealistic demands from the councillor. At some point, I think they were leaving, and one of them remarked that this could be a fight. And Pete, what can I say? I think I remarked to her at the time in our team that, look, I'm from Lens. I love a good fight. So please. And she laughed, and then she's like, so are you an attorney for the city? I said, no, actually, I'm just a town planner. I work here in housing. So they were quite shocked that some of us were actually willing to take them on at that point in time. But I think conversely, what we also approached in the city was also not to antagonize even the rights groups and the legal representatives.
Sure.
They have a right and a job to do. I think we engaged with the colleagues from SERI, from CALS. I think for the first time, and truth be told, there were quite a few of them who thanked us. It was the first time the city posed this Concord decision and actually brought them into the fold. And said, fine, there's no actual policy around this. There's no system. It's never been done before. And we have a particular perspective we can give you, share our thoughts, but we'd like you to be part of the exercise, help us craft and do this. And so there was great insight shared by them also around these things. Insights about some of the older buildings and others, and some of the atrocities taking place, some of the realities they have access to. And I think somewhere along the line, that link, which was fragile to say the least, given the history of these matters, it was damaged somewhere when one of the rights groups held municipal officials personally liable in these eviction matters.
No, I think that starts to take it to a very different level, and I mean that's something you experienced, Zunaid. And I mean, again, it's one thing to act on behalf of the employer and under instruction, but to be held in your own personal, private account, that's a very different, again, very serious business. How did you manage to cope with that, and what was your coping strategy in that regard?
That one almost drove me to drink, I won't lie. Because I was in shock at first, because that included, I think, the mayor, the municipal manager, the city's head of legal at the time, all the way through to a legal advisor in a very junior position, and myself. And we took discussion with the municipal manager at the time. One of the key things, he was relatively calm. blasé, and I'm not sure what his bank balance looked like at the time. But he was relatively calm about this. There was some stress there, I won't lie. That was some concern in that process, because we're like, okay, this has gone into a new territory now. But thankfully, the city did rally around it. Unfortunately, in the context of the process we were trying to develop and undertake in housing and as the city, to have this open, collaborative approach with all the stakeholders involved, and some of the private developers and others. I mean, there were guys from a range of different AFCO, TAF, victim, who were part of the process and were trying to get information out of it. But when it got to that point, I mean, the city then, of course, made this purely a legal response. For all matters going forward,
Sure.
It goes through legal, it takes a legal response, and then you get a little bit disconnected. I mean, not just a little, quite substantially disconnected from actually working through a policy. And I think the rights group that did this, I think they may have had a thought process to it, but I think it backfired for everybody involved, including themselves. And I think that was a tragedy of the process, because I think we were making good grounds, and it was very much a trade-off in how we use the city systems, everything from ESP and other indigenous policies, how you address issues in migrancy, those who are illegally in the city, not to flout the constitution by simply having them arrested and repatriated, but also how you have to deal then with home affairs. And that department, which is not a municipal
back to those competencies and spheres of government again.
Correct.
Isn't it?
Yeah. And so that's, so it became very difficult at the time. I think it also antagonized the city and its officials. So the doors kind of closed on really taking that in a meaningful way forward. But, it meant that the city had to do this through a different set of means. The other meant that, while that matter was in court or in play, I don't know the actual legal terms for this, it meant that, facilities that were available, one of them in particular, had to be reserved in that matter, so that the mayor was not seen to be held liable tomorrow for being non-compliant. I had an interesting discussion at that point in time, I think with, I'm not sure if he's still around or he's late now, I do speak respectfully of him, David Scrooby from the National Department, with a great legal mind. And he was quite candid at the time. He said, well, tell the mayor to go to court. The South Gauteng High Court himself, Judge Satchwell was the judge at the time. Tell him to talk to her himself. And we were in shock. But when we went through this process, you could see that those were some of the questions even the judiciary was asking. Like, so what's your plan? You have this, you're now all being held personally liable. Where's your plan for this thing? What would you like to do? Show us. And because it went into that terrain of making it purely a legal response, the city sent a legal representative to make the response. And Judge Satchwell was most disappointed with it, because that's what she was looking for. She wanted the urban planners, she wanted the others, the social housing companies, she wanted to see a plan, because she was wanting to buy into that plan to say that for the first time the city has one. And I think that's what we were trying to do. But it got complicated. There were senior staff in the city who refused to sign affidavits, particularly that one. So it could be, I think, a replying affidavit. They actually wanted the legal advisor and myself to sign it. And that's the first time in this particular matter that it came to anything at that point in time for the city that I said, no, I'm not signing.
Yeah.
It's above my pay grade.
Above your pay grade, but certainly quite a lived experience. And again, that's why I thought this would be such a valuable conversation to understand the realities of a situation. And, when you say that the judge was interested to hear about what is the plan, what is the strategy, and how are we going about these things as government, and in this instance as a metropolitan municipality with certain obligations. What do you think in the decade that's followed, and now looking at your, let's call it a bird's eye view there at National Department and reflecting back on your extensive time with the city, what do you think we've learned in that decade? And do you think, Zunaid, that we've improved our collective game between national, provincial and local authorities to address these issues? Or do you suspect that we are still very much living from one court case to the next and struggling to get our momentum and rhythm and an implementation and approach that is going to make a change, is going to be effective, is able to reach across these multiple challenges, qualifiers, non-qualifiers, typologies, affordability levels. Throw in COVID and you've got the cupboard is bare in terms of the finance. Yeah, what is your thoughts 10 years on?
I think we have learned a lot in that decade. One of the things we've learned is that disconnect between the three spheres and the moving parts and the role players here, I think is most important. I think it's even more pronounced now. And I think in terms of that, what we've also learned is that, cities have to be a bit more in fact, the state has to be much better coordinated around us. The intention is good. The access to funding could be better, but it's not bad. Excuse me. The approach needs to be more strategic, but it needs to see those dots. It needs, like I said, you need to step back from the elephant and see the whole elephant and start to connect those dots. More than looking at a particular one as the silver bullet to fix everything. And I think that's critical because from my experience of what we've learned in that process is that the attempts to address these issues have been very ad hoc and sporadic in nature, often based on different court cases. I think at one point in time, of the 14 or 15 court matters, I think 11 or 12 of them were related to housing or human settlements. The fact that it is such a phenomenal program and a delivery agenda, it has enormous potential. It's fraught with complexity, and many have come out here from many different parts of the world, even locally. Some experts in many different fields have tried to just put a finger on it. And I think it's one of those things that you can't. It's such a fluid, moving animal, this thing. But if you pull the pieces together with a range of the role players and the stakeholders, I think you can actually do better than we are. Whether we've improved our game, I don't think so. To be honest with you, I think we've rushed large parts of the game for various different reasons. I think the territorial contestations are still there between the spheres and the other. I think we've continuously talked about being one government in one state, and this is the thing. During my experience with the city, and particularly this matter and others, we had to address or make available and share our insights with a range of other municipalities in the country, some even smaller. Some large metros, deal with other organizations. Also take this particular matter and understand its application to somewhere like Alexandra Township. What does this mean for Blue Valley Estate? And there's an eviction matter. Not really what you'd think of at the first glance of something like this, but within that context of doing that, what I experienced or realizing at times is that application in that broad spectrum of things required the state also to rethink its position and its approach. It also needed, the evidence, the information, the data, to inform how you plan, how you put a strategy together, how it's not so short-sighted and just reaching some compliance, because that may sometimes not be well thought of. What are the roles and responsibilities and how you define that? And that will lead into some of the other things we wanted to talk about, but what's the responsibilities at different levels of the spectrum? How does this entire thing work for everybody in it? And I think that's where we've come short a little. That often it's very specific, it's almost small, picking locales, precinct, particular areas, finding that disconnect between the province and the city and the national department. Everybody defending their space without willing to make the trade-offs to make the space work. So I definitely think, there's opportunity. And I think in the current context, with what we're experiencing, COVID, those economic downgrades, the pressures on the fiscus, the reductions, the need for reprioritizing what we do, how we do it. We cannot do little bits of pieces here and there and everywhere in an attempt to fix the entire thing together. I don't think that's going to work anymore. And I think even in the national department, we're starting to see, really see that. There's talk of understanding that even from a human settlements perspective. It's a priority agenda in the country, but it cannot simply continue as business as usual and just go through the motions. It's got to find innovative new ways to do this type of thing. And if this crisis is disrupted anyway, I'm hoping that it's, has disrupted the business as usual approach to things. And for the state in general, but for society as a whole as well, including the other partner, private sector, civil society as well, that a collective effort is required. And the state has to lead in many ways and, ensure that others have an enabled environment within which to play and contribute collectively to that. So I definitely think it's also raised the issue of how people live. The disparities in what we're seeing. I mean, that triple threat that remained out of the NDP around unemployment, inequality, and poverty became very stark during the crisis of COVID.
Absolutely.
The other was the fact that our interconnectedness is so important. I mean, this is a virus that's arrived on a plane into this country and inadvertently will have the worst impact on the poor and some of the poorest in our society who've never been on those plans. When you look at that and just how easily that is spread and what has happened, and years ago, the former DDG, Amadi Bauder, there was a lady from the Department of Health who talked about it. That in our urban planning and our strategic thinking, we often ignore health. We ignore the things we can't see and the impact it will have. And I recall, what are these guys? Doctors Without Borders, MSF, gave a presentation in the city about the very same conditions around these buildings and the spaces. And that it's not just about decay and rates. There's a health implication. And, we're obligated to ensure that this survives because it'll have further implications downstream. And so I think in the current context, it's become more important for how we see that collectively. Not that it's just for a particular community to say, do something about it. We don't need to see it. It's an eyesore. Or for another to look at this and say, well, we're waiting for you to do everything and give it to us. It's how collectively the country actually shapes this, takes it forward. How do you think strategically at that national level to say these different departments and others, what are the roles that they play? How do silos have their own blessings, but they also have severe shortcomings when you don't work together. Millions or billions of investments in similar spaces without giving you the impact you're looking for because we haven't coordinated ourselves in a particular way that would do so. And so there's been a deliberate attempt at the moment to break down that thought process and that mindset. And this disruptive period has kind of forced the hand even further to say you're going to have to work together whether you like it or not. They're going to have to come together if you want this to go forward, you want this country to go forward. And so I think that, is very much the process going forward. And I know our human settlements colleagues and others in this particular space, the urban planning fraternity and others, for a lot of them, it's also been an exercise sometimes to have to unlearn certain things, relearn in the context of this because it's something we've never seen. And how we can repiece this, put it together. What does it mean? So I'm definitely hopeful with some of the things that are coming out, some of the talks that are happening, some of the approaches.
Indeed, Zunaid. I mean, it's interesting that you talk about, on the one hand, hope. And I think that's, the fact that you're saying that from your perspective, there is hope and there are opportunities in that. And at the same time, the impact is going to be fundamental. I guess let's just talk about impact. And I mean, your work with the M&E, the Monitoring and Evaluation Unit there, and the work that you've done on the medium-term strategic framework, or the MTSF, which gives a very, very sort of a national and broad perspective of the state of play and things that you're monitoring. What do you think that is going to, how can that help us as citizens, as practitioners, as advocacy groups to think about how we hold national to account in this coming 5-year period? Any thoughts about that before we bring the conversation to a conclusion?
The MTSF, I think, Pete, is a really interesting tool. It's my first experience with it since joining the DPNA, and I can see why it's being used. I mean, other countries are also using it, from China and a range of others. It's not the first time. It's a form of implementation plan of the National Development Plan. So one of the key things about this particular one is that how it's still uses the NDP 2030 as its lodestar, but it factors in a range of other strategic policy initiatives and directions, including the State of the Nation address, other priorities. But also, as I mentioned earlier, it makes a deliberate attempt to address these issues around silos and ensuring there's a more coordinated way in which government operates. So one of the key things, if you look at it, it's within that context of that document, you'll see it has lead and contributing departments. And that has been a challenge in of itself with our departments, national departments and colleagues, because I'm not used to seeing something like that. It says there's a lead with other contributing departments. It requires coordination and effort collectively, because we're looking, excuse me, for the impacts, as you're saying. We want to follow a results-based process that says, in terms of assessing this, it's not just saying the delivery numbers.
Sure.
We delivered so much, but what was the actual impact of this? And we're aware that certain things you'll measure impact over a longer term. Within that context, it has those 7 national priorities, which were actually designed to bring together these various departments in different spaces for particular priorities. And the one I'm particularly involved with was around spatial priority 5, which included spatial integration, issues around spatial transformation, local government, human settlements, and how this piece. So one of the first things you'll notice is the MTSF for the first time has a spatial dimension to it.
Mm-hmm.
It has within that the National Spatial Development Framework. So it's providing a national spatial lens, because whatever we do here at the moment takes place in space. And over many years, we haven't spatialized our economy. We haven't spatialized the capability of the state. And it can be done. Where is it being done? Where are the shortfalls? So this gives you an understanding that, or to even the ordinary citizen out here, to say that we're now taking this thing to say that this is the national spatial agenda. This is what we want to do. And it's not just that's at a national level. That, of course, cascades and filters itself down into provincial level and then at a local government level. It also is that there's a very distinct mention and inclusion of local government. That there's clear understanding that provinces also have a role to play, and very much so that the MTSF is partnership based. So even within that spatial context, it involves, as I mentioned earlier, that collective approach to making this happen. It's not going to happen purely through the state. It's not going to happen only through the private sector. It's requiring everybody, this all of government, all of society approach to say that this is what we want to do. This is the trajectory and path we'd like to follow for the next few years. Additionally, it also gives, I think, as you asked, the public the opportunity to hold national government generally and accountable. So you have all these documents, these plans, and this is what you're going to be doing. But obviously not in a very literal sense, because a lot of these things are cumulatively aggregated inputs. So municipalities, and I've often cited an example, Pete, for some of our colleagues in national departments elsewhere and working, and said, look, if you own a motor vehicle, you own a car. And if I had to ask you, you could probably tell me about the engine, gearbox, maybe a few other things. But if I asked you to tell me about the fuse, you probably couldn't. But that 50 Rand little item will leave you on the side of the road, whether you own 100,000 Rand car or a 5 million Rand car. So it's how all these little pieces and components come together. They're not insignificant to make that machine work, to do what it has to do. And the MTSF and the range of other elements that are coming out of provinces and municipalities, this is the collective thing that we're looking at. And this is how we're trying to put it so the public also understands, and others, that everybody's contributing. We may not see it directly, but this is the contribution to this national agenda. It says this is how we're going to attempt to achieve what was set in the NDP and take it forward. And within that context, I mean, the agenda around spatial transformation is something we are focusing on, because it is something we've noted has also been on the table for 20 years. It hasn't got a lot of traction. It's made, limited amounts of progress in certain places and others. And I've often cited that in our current context, it's like finding a rose in a landfill. But beyond that, we're trying to drive the process forward to say that post this disruptive period, the MTSF and what we're attempting to do, the inclusion of this spatial dimension in this national strategic framework. Thereby, we also want to have spatial transformation and spatial integration colloquium, with a range of small steps that involves a range of different stakeholders and parties, done collaboratively with the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, to put this on the agenda, but not talk about it in that type of almost biblical scripture-like tone. But we want to confront the issues this time and confront it meaningfully with, working towards concrete recommendations that will, to a large extent, inform the subsequent reviews and adjustments of the NSDF, but inform the next MTSF, particularly around the spatial agenda. You cannot attempt to achieve spatial transformation if you don't discuss the use of space and how it's used, the conditionalities and who manages that, issues around urban management, the macroeconomic dimension, because that has an impact on spatial transformation. And simplistically, issues around safety, economic growth, as we mentioned, because these all have a play within the spectrum. The role of municipalities, provinces, the national departments, the district development model, and what that means for coordinating government in a particular space. The trade-offs that have to be made so we can adjust and change trajectory, the development path, more concretely than as opposed to at a very high, vague level that sometimes hasn't yielded the results. We've seen massive investments in some of the districts and others without the desired impact because it's the wrong types of investment.
With that, Zunaid, I want to thank you very much for the time that you've spent with us this evening. I recognize again from the get-go and the introductory remarks that you made, very traumatic day for you and the department that you work for. And again, our thoughts and condolences go to the department and the minister's family and friends. But thank you for spending the time this evening, taking us back on a journey back 10 years ago to the Blue Moonlight court case ruling and findings, how it shaped some of our thinking, and then also touching on this MTSF and medium-term strategic framework and what that can help us in the years to come. Thanks so much, Zunaid. I want to wish you and the family all the very best. Please stay safe, and we'll pick up the conversation in the months to come.
Thank you very much, Pete. It's been an honor and privilege here, and I hope I was able to share some insight. But thank you very much, and to your listeners and others, yes, of course, condolences to our minister's family and others, but I think condolences to many South Africans who have lost their lives and others, and to those people out there battling. Please be safe, be strong. We hope we'll come out of this on the other side a lot better. And to you, thank you very much. It's been a long time coming and great. This is a wonderful initiative. I've enjoyed many of your podcasts, and I wish you all the best in taking this forward, man. This has been a highlight of some of the urban planning and discussion platforms around different topics. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you, Zunaid. The thing is only as good as the people that come onto it, and I think you've given us an immense amount to think about and reflect on, and I'm eternally grateful. Be safe, Zunaid. Thanks a lot. All the best. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Talking Transformation podcast. Please engage with us and let us know your thoughts on this episode. You can do so via the Anchor podcast platform. There's a voice message function available via the app. You can also follow us on Twitter via Talking Transfo and the number 1. So Talking Transfo 1. Our theme music is kindly made available by Tribal Need. Find out about the music, the street art shows here in Cape Town and Europe via tribalneed.com.